Okay, yes. Here we go, class. Just wanted to give you a little background audio video lecture on Edgar Allan Poe. We'll be looking at Poe's three of Poe's stories, Ligeia, about the death of a beautiful woman, The Fall of the House of Usher, which also is about the death of a woman, um, and The Telltale Heart, which is the story of a murderer who had a guilty complex, actually. Um, let's give you a little background on Poe. Born, I think, 1800, died 1840, 40 years old. A man who um, basically lived in poverty throughout his life, although he produced an incredible amount of work. So he always battled poverty. He was underpaid. He was overworked, and usually the most he ever made for many of his writings, his stories, for instance, Ligeia, I think he was paid $10 for that story, and that's typical of many writers who do not achieve fame in their lives, and only through posterity do they gain a share of immortality. And that was, of course, Poe's fate. Um, he died in Baltimore. Was found there. Died from exposure after apparently a bout with alcoholism. It's all about Poe. His life was rather short and sad, but as I say, a short, troubled life, but really did produce an incredible amount of work. Um, the short stories, poems, essays, criticism. It's really amazing what he did produce. Of course, it's always mentioned in his biography that he was married when he was 26 years old to his 13-year-old cousin. You got to remember, first cousin marriages weren't that unusual at the time. The woman he married, Virginia, she was young, of course, 13. You would consider that incredibly criminal and pedophilia, the mark of a pedophile in today's world. But 150 years ago, 200, 200 years ago, things were a little bit different. But she died early, and I don't really think Poe ever recovered from her early death. I'm trying to remember, pneumonia, something like that. And a lot of his work is really based on the fact of someone, a character or a narrator, trying to get over the death of a beloved woman or someone, a lost love, someone who died prematurely, is beautiful and at a young age. And so the idea to bring that beloved back to life somehow, um, through some grotesque reawakening or reincarnation, life beyond the grave. That is an obsession with some of the characters in his stories. Just some key points about Poe. His characters are very psychologically complex. Um, they're often suffering from deep psychological states, whether they're in mourning, they're depressed, they're anxious, they're struggling with addiction to some physical substance, either alcohol or, in many cases, opium. It was a very popular drug then. Um, so deep psychological complexity in these characters. Um, this so the idea of some of Poe's narrators is dreamers. Um, in The Fall of the House of Usher, a very complex character. And some of these stories, such as The Fall of House of Usher, can almost be interpreted as the narrator's dream, in essence, almost like an opium dream. Um, Particularly in The Fall of the House of Usher, the term dream appears in the narration a couple of times. For instance, shaking off what must have been a dream. I listened as if in a dream. Constant references to dreaming. Or maybe, and a lot of these dreams turn out to be nightmares, of course, in these stories. Um, and of course, similarly, also Poe explores how these various states of dreaming reflect the unconscious mind. Poe was very interested in that. Uh, Dreams reflect our innermost fears, sometimes our innermost desires. Go back to Freud's id. Um, the student in The Raven, the poem The Raven, finds himself when he hears the ravens tapping at my chamber door. These memories, sort of dream state that these characters are often in. Another point to remember about Poe, he likes to use doubles, contrast of opposites. Often characters have alter egos or doubles, suggesting a kind of incompleteness, fragmentation, self-loathing. The id and the ego. Um, the id, which simply wants what it wants, desires unrestrained, and then the ego, the conscious mind, reflecting some kind of moral basis, the moral policing. Characters often in Poe stories try to escape, destroy, or bury the part of the self that the double represents. Um, Oftentimes, though, as in a few stories like The Fall of the House of Usher, The Telltale Heart, the annihilation of half the self results in the annihilation of the other half of the self as well. So, the utter self destruction, in a sense. You're going to see this in these stories, particularly in Ligeia. You have Ligeia, the beautiful woman who passes away, and Rowena, the woman the narrator marries as a replacement for Ligeia. In The Fall of the House of Usher, you have the siblings, Roderick Usher and Madeline Usher. It can also represent two halves of the same self, and you see this throughout. Um, Excuse me, an inadvertent sneeze, which I couldn't avoid due to allergies. But anyway, we're not going to get into this too much in our reading of Poe, but he's also considered sort of the father of the detective story. Stories like The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Purloined Letter. You get this detective who's trying to solve a crime. So he kind of originated detective fiction. You have to give the guy credit. He created this character named Dupin, who was a French detective, sort of later became the prototype for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's creation of Sherlock Holmes. So it's kind of a fusion of the intellect and the imagination. So you get the rational mind, and you also get the more the imaginative side of this too, in some of these stories. Poe often wrote about something he called supernal beauty, Supernal, the beauty above, kind of a beauty beyond the grave. It's almost platonic, certainly Gothic, certainly romantic in a way. For him, he thought the notion of conveying this kind of rare beauty is the highest function of art. So a lot of times in his stories and also in his poems, sound, repetition, rhythm, creating this kind of hypnotic effect. In essence, you certainly will see that in The Raven and Annabel Lee, the two poems. He definitely did rely in his poetry on sound, replication, repetition, that kind of thing. So you definitely see the emphasis on sound in the poem, in the poems in particular. As far as Poe as being in the romantic tradition, certainly seems to be in the mainstream quite a bit. He does set his work in often enclosed cage spaces, individuals tormented by psychic forces and demons, and their escape is never fully realized. So these tales are deeply psychological. It was well before Freud and the concept of the unconscious mind and so forth. That didn't come until the 20th century, early 20th century. But Poe definitely seems to explore that early on in his work. Poe really doesn't write very much about this world. It's an imaginary world. It's a world of loss, of memory, of an attempt to recapture a certain level of beauty. Um, Oftentimes the breakdown between the conscious world and the unconscious world, reality and the world of dreams, is often fused in his works. And the thing to remember too, it's really hard to trust these narrators. He sort of invented that whole idea of the unreliable narrator. Can you really trust the narrator's sense of the story and the way the story's been told and the facts of the story? Certainly in The Telltale Heart, as we'll see, the narrator can't be trusted because he's deeply imbalanced, psychotic, in fact, criminally insane, maybe. I wouldn't say that about the narrators in Ligeia, the narrator in Ligeia necessarily. But again, this obsession is looking for some lost world that no longer exists, trying to capture the essence of that world we often see. Anyway, that's a little bit of a background on Poe. And one thing to remember too about Poe, I don't want you to confuse Poe with the narrators of his story. He uses I a lot. A lot of the stories are told in first person point of view. Not necessarily, don't confuse the narrator of the poem or the story with the author. You can't really do that. Poe, I don't think literally, he didn't sleep near anyone's tomb. He wasn't buried prematurely and then woke up in a coffin in the dark, that kind of thing. These are tales of the imagination. It's a very strange imagination that we have at work here. Poe's influence was really vast. He had a big influence on the French writers later in the 19th century. Charles Baudelaire, the poet, a number of poets of the symbolist movement, Impressionist, Surrealism in France. He's had an incredibly wide influence. And don't forget, too, that, of course, he pretty much was the father of the modern detective story. It was kind of interesting. This little something on the first story that I asked you to read, Ligeia. A couple things here, of course, the death of a beautiful woman. We see that in a lot of Poe stories. And also the resurrection of that woman from the dead in some way, either through premature burial, then awakening in a tomb or in a casket. There's some type of reincarnation of the lost, beloved figure. Again, another theme in this story, Ligeia, substance abuse. The narrator admits that he is addicted to opium. So again, you have to question anything that he says from that standpoint. This particular story, Ligeia, like many of Poe's stories, has resulted in a number of film adaptations, TV adaptations, and so forth. There was a movie called The Tomb of Ligeia, came out in 1964, directed by Roger Corman. It was the eighth story or poem that this director adapted into a film. I mean, you can look him up. He did a bunch of them. The Fall of the House of Usher, The Black Cat, The Pit and the Pendulum. And they starred one particular guy that Corman was very fond of using. His name was Vincent Price. He became very famous by playing lead roles in a number of these film adaptations of Poe stories. And again, Lygia's theme of death and the resurrection of a beloved woman, we see throughout film. Alfred Hitchcock in a film called Vertigo, which the woman that he's a man the main character in that plays a detective who's trying to find out what happened to a woman who disappeared. Um, he finally finds her, and then she allegedly dies. But as it turns out, he sees her die. She falls from uh, the um, the bell tower of a church onto a roof and is killed. But as it turns out, it was just a ruse. It was a plot by someone who hired this private investigator to investigate his wife. And it turns out he simply did that just to double back on his real intent, which was to murder his wife. Later on, the detective, who happens to fall in love with the woman that he is investigating, sees what appears to be her double, someone who just looks just like her on the streets of San Francisco. And of course, as it turns out, um, the woman was an actress who was playing the role of the wife in the investigation. So that whole sense of a woman dies with whom the narrator is in love, and then there's a reincarnation through some form of that beloved woman. We see that a lot, these adaptations of Poe's works in film and other forms. Most recently is a 2008 independent feature, originally known by the title Edgar Allan Poe's Ligeia, but later renamed The Tomb. You can probably look that one up. Film stars Wes Bentley, Michael Madsen, and Eric Roberts. Eric Roberts is the brother of famed film actress Julia Roberts. Michael Madsen is kind of a character actor. He's been in a number of Quentin Tarantino's films, such as, I remember, Kill Bill, volumes 1 and 2, and a few others, I believe, that Madsen has been in. So, anyway, some background on Poe. A man obsessed more with death than life, actually. I think what he tried to do in his stories and his poems was to achieve a sort of sublime appreciation of beauty, both physical and spiritual. But again, Poe is not of this world, really. You can't really compare him to some of the other romantics that we've looked at, such as Thoreau and Emerson in this section of American Lit. They were kind of rooted in the real world. They loved nature. Thoreau went to Walden Pond, lived in nature. But in some ways, Poe is like them, kind of striving for some kind of experience just beyond beyond normal experience, some type of elevation of the senses. It's really hard to say. For Emerson and Thoreau, nature was that vehicle to achieve some type of sense of the sublime and the beautiful. For Poe, it's more these imaginary worlds. Not so much nature. You really don't see that in Poe. Everything is darkened. You get the sense of the Gothic, of magic, visitations, hauntings, psychological terror, that sort of thing. Anyway, I thought it would give you a good little background as we explore the works of Edgar Allan Poe, tales of the grotesque and tales of the arabesque.